I sat in the dim light of the study, my fingers trembling as they clutched the DVD. The label read, The Birth of Nathan, April 17th, 2023. It felt like an eternity since I had stumbled upon it, each moment stretching endlessly as I grappled with its implications. The conversation with Richard earlier that day echoed in my mind, his words cutting deep. Infertility treatment? Why bother with that? Just focus on your duties around here, he had dismissed. It was then I felt reduced to nothing more than a mere convenience in his life. As I heard the front door open, signaling Richard's return, panic and resolve warred within me. I quickly concealed the DVD under a stack of papers and braced myself. My heart pounded against my ribcage, but I couldn't let fear win. "Richard, we need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He gave me a cursory glance, annoyance etched on his face. "What now, Emily? More complaints about feeling lonely or neglected?" Taking a deep breath, I confronted him. "It's about us, about our family. I found something today, Richard. A DVD." I watched his demeanor shift, a fleeting look of fear replacing his annoyance. "What DVD? What are you talking about?" "The Birth of Nathan," I said, allowing the name to linger between us. "Who is Nathan, Richard? And who is Laura?" His facade crumbled. Panic flickered in his eyes as he looked for an escape. "It's not what you think, Emily. You're jumping to conclusions." "Am I?" My voice rose, a mix of anger and hurt. "I watched it, Richard. I saw you there with her during the birth. You were there for her in a way you've never been for me." His silence was a deafening confirmation. My world, once so stable, was crumbling. The man I had devoted my life to was a stranger, his betrayal exposed in the cruelest of ways. The doorbell's chime broke through the tense silence. I answered it to find a man, probably in his late 20s, looking back at me with an anxious expression. "Hello, can I help you?" My voice was barely a whisper. The man hesitated. "I'm Daniel. Is Richard here? I need to speak to him about Laura. It's urgent." A cold shiver ran down my spine at the mention of Laura's name. This was no coincidence. "Please come in," I said, moving aside. "I think we have a lot to discuss, Daniel." As we sat in the living room, the puzzle began to assemble itself. Daniel, Laura's ex-boyfriend, believed he might be Nathan's father, a child Richard claimed as his own. My marriage, it seemed, was built on lies and deceit. "I need your help," Daniel's voice was laced with desperation. "I have to know the truth about Nathan." I looked at him, feeling a newfound resolve. "You'll have it. We both will." As Richard entered the room, unaware of the impending storm, one thing became crystal clear to me. My life was about to change forever. I never imagined that my life would become a twisted tale of deceit. As I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, my mind replayed the years spent with Richard. Our marriage, once a source of joy, now felt like a beautifully wrapped lie. I remembered our wedding day, the promise of a future filled with love and shared dreams. Richard had seemed like the perfect match, a successful businessman with a charming demeanor. But soon, the fairy tale began to unravel. Our attempts to start a family became a silent battleground. Every month brought disappointment, and with it Richard's indifference grew. I became a shadow in my own home, my presence only acknowledged when chores or errands demanded attention. The memory of my last attempt to address our childlessness resurfaced. "Richard, it's been 3 years. Maybe we should see a doctor, consider fertility treatment?" His response was a cold dismissal. "We don't need that. Just focus on your duties here." His words stung like a slap. It wasn't just about a child. It was about being partners, supporting each other. But to Richard, I was just a fixture in his pristine house, a part of the background. My thoughts were interrupted by the chime of my phone. A message from Daniel. "Can we meet tomorrow? I have something to show you." Curiosity and a sense of solidarity with Daniel compelled me to agree. The next morning, over coffee in a quiet cafe, Daniel shared his story. He and Laura had been in a serious relationship before Richard swept her off her feet. Daniel's face twisted in pain as he recounted how he had lost Laura to Richard's allure and wealth. "But I can't believe Nathan is Richard's son," Daniel said, his voice firm. "I've seen pictures of Nathan, and there's a resemblance to me at that age." His words sparked a fire within me. Richard's betrayal was deeper than I had imagined. He didn't just cheat, he stole a child's identity, a father's right. Daniel slid an envelope across the table. "I've hired a private investigator. We'll get to the bottom of this." I felt a mix of fear and determination as I took the envelope. It was time to face the ugly truth head on. And if Richard was indeed the liar and cheat he appeared to be, he would have to answer for it. Not just to me, but to everyone he had deceived. I returned home with a clear mission. I would no longer be the silent, dutiful wife. Richard's facade would crumble, and his true, repulsive nature would be exposed. And I would be the one to light the fuse. As I sat across from Richard at dinner, the silence was suffocating. Each clink of cutlery sounded like a thunderclap in the tense air. I could barely swallow my food, my thoughts consumed by the plan forming in my mind. "Richard," I finally broke the silence, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "We need to talk about our future." He looked up, his eyes void of the warmth they once held. "What about it, Emily? Planning more vacations to fill your empty days?" The disdain in his voice was a sharp reminder of how far we drifted apart. "No, Richard, it's about us, about our family," I pressed on, feeling a strange mix of fear and empowerment. He scoffed, pushing his plate away. "What family, Emily? We don't have kids, remember? Or is this about that ridiculous DVD again?" I felt my resolve harden. "Yes, it's about the DVD, Richard. It's about Nathan, and it's about Laura." My heart pounded in my chest, but I was determined to confront him. For a moment, Richard seemed taken aback, his facade cracking. Then he regained his composure and sneered. "What do you want, Emily? An apology? An explanation? Or perhaps a share of my wealth?" His words were like venom, each syllable dripping with contempt. I stared at him, aghast at the man he'd become, or perhaps the man he'd always been. "You know what, Richard? I want the truth," I said, my voice rising. "I want to know why you brought that woman into our lives, why you lied to me, to everyone." Richard leaned back in his chair, a cold smile playing on his lips. "You want the truth, Emily? Fine. I was bored. You were always so busy playing the perfect housewife, so obsessed with having a child. Laura was different. Exciting." His confession struck me like a physical blow. He had betrayed our vows, our life together, for a mere diversion. I felt a surge of anger, hot and unyielding. "And Nathan?" I asked, my voice trembling with rage. Richard shrugged, his indifference a stark contrast to my turmoil. A convenient lie. Laura needed a father for her child, and I needed entertainment. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're despicable, Richard. You used a child, a woman, to satisfy your selfish needs, and you used me, your wife." Richard stood too, his eyes gleaming with malice. "And what will you do about it, Emily? Divorce me? Go ahead. You'll be left with nothing." His threat hung in the air, but it no longer frightened me. I had nothing left to lose. "I'll do more than just leave you, Richard," I said, my voice cold and resolute. "I'll expose you for the fraud you are. Everyone will know the truth about Richard the Great." As I stormed out of the room, leaving Richard in stunned silence, I knew there was no turning back. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready to fight. I met with Daniel early the next morning, the winter sun casting a pale light over the city. He greeted me with a solemn nod, his eyes reflecting a shared determination. "We need to expose Richard, Emily," Daniel said as we found a quiet corner in the bustling cafe. "I have information from the private investigator. It's not pretty." I braced myself, knowing that whatever Daniel had to say would only fuel the fire of my resolve. "Tell me everything," I urged, my voice firm. Daniel slid a folder across the table to me. Inside were photographs, bank statements, and a timeline of Richard's deceit. It was all there in black and white. The affair with Laura, the secret payments, the lies he had woven so skillfully. "It's worse than we thought," Daniel said gravely. "Richard has been supporting Laura financially. He's been paying for her apartment, her living expenses, everything." I felt a cold fury settle in my chest. Richard had not only cheated on me, but had also used our resources to sustain his illicit affair. "And Nathan?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel hesitated, then spoke. "Nathan is most likely your child, Emily. Laura was already pregnant when she met Richard. He knew it and still played the doting father to the world." The revelation hit me like a tidal wave. Richard's betrayal was more profound than I could have ever imagined. He had stolen the identity of a child, my child, for his twisted game. "We have to bring this to light," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "We'll expose him at the family gathering. It's in 2 weeks. Everyone will be there." Daniel nodded in agreement. I'll be there too. We'll confront him together. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and restless nights. I felt like a shadow in my own home, avoiding Richard's gaze, ignoring his attempts at conversation. My heart was set on one thing only: revenge. The day of the gathering arrived, a cold and clear winter day. The family home was filled with laughter and chatter, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside me. As the evening wore on, I found my moment. I stood, my hands trembling slightly, and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have something to show you. Something that will change the way you see Richard." All eyes turned to me, including Richard's, which held a flicker of fear for the first time. I played the DVD, the images of Laura giving birth, Richard by her side, filling the screen. The room fell into stunned silence. "This is not just any woman," I said, my voice steady. "This is Laura, Richard's mistress. And the child? He's mine. Richard has been living a lie." The gasps and murmurs filled the room. Richard stood up, his face contorted with rage. "Emily, what is this madness?" he spat out. "You're embarrassing yourself and our family." But I stood my ground. "No, Richard, the only embarrassment here is you. Your lies, your deceit, it all ends tonight." Daniel stepped forward, his presence a silent support. "She's telling the truth. I've seen the evidence. Richard has been funding Laura's life with his affair." Richard's face was a mask of fury and fear. "You'll pay for this, Emily. Both of you." But it was too late. The truth was out, and Richard's world was crumbling around him. As the family erupted into chaos, I felt a strange sense of calm. I had done it. I had exposed Richard for the fraud he was, and in doing so, I had reclaimed my life. The family gathering had turned into a battlefield, and I stood at its center, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and triumph. Richard's mask of composure had slipped, revealing the man he truly was. "You've gone too far, Emily," Richard hissed, his face twisted in anger. "You're trying to ruin me with lies." His denial only fueled my resolve. "Lies? You call this a lie?" I gestured to the screen, still displaying the image of him with Laura. "The truth is right there for everyone to see." Murmurs rippled through the room. Relatives exchanged shocked glances, their expressions ranging from disbelief to disgust. Richard's mother, a kind woman who had always treated me like a daughter, her voice trembled with emotion. "Richard, how could you do this? To Emily, to our family?" Richard's gaze darted around the room, seeking an ally, finding none. "Mother, it's not what it looks like. Emily is manipulating everything." But his words fell on deaf ears. The evidence was overwhelming. The family's disappointment and anger were palpable. Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady. "There's more. Richard has been financially supporting Laura and her child, using family funds. He's been living a double life." The revelation sent another shockwave through the room. Richard's father, a stern man of few words, rose from his seat. "Is this true, Richard? Have you been stealing from your own family?" Richard's composure crumbled. "It's not stealing. I earned that money. I can do what I want with it." His selfishness was on full display, and the family recoiled from him as if he were a stranger. "You're no son of mine," his father declared, his voice echoing with finality. I felt a strange sense of detachment as I watched Richard's world fall apart. He had built his life on lies and deceit, and now he was paying the price. "Emily, I'm sorry," Richard said, turning to me with desperation in his eyes. "I never meant for it to go this far. Please, let's talk about this." But it was too late for apologies. "There's nothing to discuss, Richard. I want a divorce, and I want you out of my life for good." The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air. Richard looked around, his expression one of disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend how quickly his life had unraveled. As I left the room, followed by a stunned silence, I knew that this was just the beginning. Richard would face the consequences of his actions, and I would start a new chapter of my life, free from his lies. The days following the family gathering were a whirlwind. News of Richard's deceit spread like wildfire, tarnishing his once respected name. I watched from a distance as the empire he built on lies crumbled around him. Richard attempted to reach out, his messages oscillating between pleading and anger. "Emily, we can fix this. Don't throw away what we have over one mistake," one message read. The next would be filled with accusations. "You've ruined me. How could you be so heartless?" But I remained resolute. His words no longer held power over me. I was done being a pawn in his twisted game. As the divorce proceedings began, Richard's true nature became even more apparent. He fought tooth and nail for every penny, his greed overshadowing any remnants of the man I once loved. "I won't let you leave me with nothing," he spat during one of our meetings. "You think you can destroy me and walk away? I'll make sure you regret this." But his threats were empty, his power waning. The evidence of his infidelity and misuse of funds had left him with little legal ground to stand on. The final blow came when his parents, once his staunchest supporters, turned their backs on him. "We can't condone what you've done, Richard. You're no longer welcome in this family," his father declared, the disappointment in his voice cutting through the tense air of the courtroom. As I walked out of the courthouse, the final divorce papers in hand, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I was free from Richard, free from the web of lies that had ensnared me for so long. But my victory was bittersweet. I had loved Richard once, and watching him fall so far was not a cause for celebration. It was a sad, albeit necessary, end to a chapter of my life. As I started anew, I found strength in my newfound independence. I had faced Richard and his deceit head-on and emerged stronger. It was a testament to my resilience, a promise of a brighter future, free from the shadows of the past. The day I signed the divorce papers, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, but also a sense of loss for what might have been. Richard, once a man I loved, had become a stranger defined by his greed and deceit. I started rebuilding my life piece by piece. The process wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of the past years seemed too much to bear. But with each passing day, I grew stronger, more confident in my newfound independence. One afternoon, several months after the divorce, I found myself at a small, quaint cafe. The place was a stark contrast to the lavish lifestyle I had once known with Richard. It was here, amidst the simple, unpretentious surroundings, that I finally felt at peace. As I sipped my coffee, lost in thought, a familiar face caught my attention. Daniel walked in, looking around before his eyes met mine. He smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Emily, it's good to see you," he said, taking the seat opposite me. "Daniel, how have you been?" I asked, returning his smile. "Well, I've been busy, working on a new project, keeping myself occupied," he replied. "And you? How are you holding up?" I took a moment before answering, reflecting on the journey I had been through. "I'm doing well, actually. It's been a time of self-discovery, of healing." We talked for hours, our conversation flowing easily. Daniel shared his dreams for the future, his passion for his work. I found myself opening up about my aspirations, my hopes for a new chapter in my life. As the cafe began to empty, Daniel reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "Emily, I've seen the strength and courage you've shown. You've inspired me in more ways than you can imagine." His words warmed my heart, and I felt a connection with him, a bond forged through shared adversity. "Daniel, I started, but words failed me." He squeezed my hand gently. "I know, Emily, and I'm here whenever you're ready to start again, to start something new, together." I looked into his eyes, seeing the kindness and understanding that had been absent in my life for so long. In that moment, I realized that while one chapter had closed, another was waiting to be written. "Thank you, Daniel," I whispered, a sense of hope blossoming within me. "I think I'm ready to start that new chapter now." As we left the cafe together, I felt a lightness in my step, a sense of optimism about the future. Life had thrown me into the depths of despair, but I had emerged stronger, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead.
I'm Amelia, about to turn 27 this year. I've been happily married for 5 years, and my son Martin just celebrated his 4th birthday. I used to work full-time after we got married, but now I balance part-time work at the same company. My husband Brian is 33 years older than me. Brian's initial enthusiasm in our dating days was exciting, but after we got married, his behavior changed. He became more domineering. Brian has a 20-year-old sister named Jane, and their age difference seems to make Brian more indulgent with her. Before we were married, I didn't mind Jane's frequent visits. I assumed they had a close relationship. But after we tied the knot, I noticed Jane's behavior shift. She often drops by unannounced, expecting to be served without bringing anything to show her appreciation. Brian, instead of addressing this, expects me to cater to her demands. Jane treats me like I'm invisible, only speaking to Brian. Despite not preparing for an extra guest, I end up serving dinner to Jane. Brian, rather than understanding, blames me for not being more considerate. Even when Jane apologizes, it's clear she enjoys the preferential treatment Brian gives her. Left with leftovers, I make my own meal while Brian and Jane chat on the sofa, leaving the dining table a mess. They treat Martin and me more like hired help than family. One evening, as I'm about to bathe Martin, Brian interrupts loudly, demanding I buy a cake for Jane despite the late hour. Jane insists on having it right away, and Brian blames me for the delay. Feeling pressured, I reluctantly take Martin to the cake shop. Overhearing their conversation, I learn they're criticizing me and questioning why Brian married me. Martin, though too young to understand the words, senses the tension. I try to hide my frustration and ask him about his cake preference. He cheerfully requests one with lots of fruit. Our trip to the cake shop was filled with discussions about cakes, momentarily distracting me from Brian's harsh words. Martin and I arrived just before closing time. Fortunately, we found the cake Jane desired, so we purchased 2 cakes, including the fruit-loaded one Martin wanted. Back home, I served the cakes to Jane and Brian, then prepared Martin's cake and headed to the dining room. The moment I placed it in front of Martin, Jane pointed and expressed her desire for that cake. Before I could react, Brian moved Martin's chosen cake in front of Jane, disregarding Martin's protests. Brian justified his action, claiming he bought the cake with his earnings and had the right to choose for Martin. Unable to contain my emotions any longer, I voiced my dissatisfaction. In response, Brian threatened with divorce. Martin, who had stopped crying, anxiously held my hand and then, after some thought, said, "Mom, I also love cake with strawberries on it. Yes, it's really delicious." He mentioned this while eating the cake initially wanted by Jane. Feeling that Martin was enduring too much, I lifted his cake plate. When I saw Jane reaching for it, I took Martin to the next room so he could enjoy his cake in peace. Brian apologized to Jane, claiming he was sorry for being stingy. Despite wanting to retort, I held back for Martin's sake. Watching Martin innocently enjoy his cake was a heartwarming sight. After finishing the cake, we decided to have a late bath and sleep in Martin's bed. The next morning, I discovered Jane had already left. As I prepared breakfast, I heard Martin crying. Shockingly, his piggy bank, a gift from my father, was broken and the saved money was gone. Martin, who always said goodnight to the piggy bank, was left heartbroken. When I questioned Brian about it, he casually mentioned that Jane needed some money, so she took it from the piggy bank. Holding a crying and shaking Martin, I felt his pain so acutely that I cried with him. It was painful to witness Brian prioritizing and caring for his sister more than our son. Expressing my anger and sadness, I confronted Brian, breaking my usual silence on arguments in front of Martin. Brian, without a word, went to the bedroom and returned with something shocking in hand: divorce papers. I discovered the hidden divorce papers that Brian had tucked away somewhere I didn't know. In a sudden burst, he confronted me, shoving the papers at me before storming out of the house with a loud bang. Martin, who had never cried over the issues with Brian and Jane, seemed to have reached his limit, crying since last night. Unable to bear seeing Martin so hurt, I suggested skipping daycare for the day, and he happily agreed with a loud yes, showing a faint smile. We spent the day playing and bonding, with Martin bringing a picture book from the shelf, sitting on my lap, and happily remarking, "The teacher at the nursery today was Mama, right? He looks like an angel." His little heart seemed filled with patience, and I decided to make the day special by taking a day off from work. Despite causing potential trouble at my workplace, they kindly understood the situation and granted me a day off. In the morning, we visited the park, played hide and seek, and had fun in the sandbox and on the slide. When we returned home for lunch, Martin appeared sleepy, usually napping by himself, but today he fell asleep on my lap, like when he was a baby. Though I initially thought of doing household chores during his nap, I decided that today was special. Instead, I allowed myself to be healed by his peaceful sleeping face and gentle breathing. However, my serene moment was abruptly interrupted by a noise from the entrance, indicating the front door had opened. As it wasn't Brian's usual time to come home, I became suspicious and quickly hid in the bedroom closet, clutching Martin. A voice echoed through the house, and to my surprise, it was Jane. Trembling with fear, I listened as she searched for something, expressing frustration over not finding it. Jane then made a phone call, mentioning Brian and discussing their unsuccessful search. After hearing her lock the front door and leave, I put Martin to bed and contemplated the strange events. I couldn't comprehend why Jane had entered the house and what they were looking for. Suddenly, Brian seemed like a stranger, and I felt a mix of disgust and fear towards him. Swiftly packing essentials for Martin and myself, we headed to the station and took a train to my parents' house. Fortunately, their home was nearby, just 2 stations away. Although I hadn't contacted them beforehand, my parents sensed something from my expression and welcomed us without asking questions. I shared the entire ordeal with them, including my fear of staying at our house due to Brian and Jane's actions. Upon hearing my mother's suggestion that Jane might have been looking for my belongings, possibly cash or cards, I recalled my past experience as a successful CEO in the handmade goods industry. I had entrusted the company to friends when I decided to prioritize raising my child after getting married. Although I still worked part-time and communicated with the company from home, Brian was unaware that I was still the CEO. I discovered the hidden divorce papers that Brian had tucked away, suspecting that he thought I had a decent amount of savings. While I've mentioned to him that I still receive some assistance from the company, I've deliberately kept the details about being the CEO and my savings private. This secrecy stems from realizing early in our marriage that Brian struggles with managing money and tends to spend everything he earns. Kevin, at first, provided only $200 a month for food expenses and even suggested I quit my job to become a full-time housewife. However, with the financial strain of raising Martin and only $200 for food, I never agreed to be a full-time housewife. Eventually, he reluctantly allowed me to work part-time. To ensure I wouldn't consider divorce, he had me sign a postmarital property waiver through a lawyer. Since Martin's birth, I used my savings for his nursery fees and clothes. Since I've only received $200 for food, I've never asked Brian for additional funds beyond the food budget, leading him to believe I have savings. Considering Jane's apparent need for money and Brian's perception of my financial situation, they might be searching for my cash cards. I have a separate savings account dedicated to Martin with a portion of my salary directly deposited into it each month. Despite their search, they won't find the cash cards as I always carry my valuables. However, there's still an unsettling issue. Jane might be entering our house even when we're not there, and Brian may be allowing it. Following my father's advice, I decided to store my valuables, including the cash cards, in my parents' safe. As I pondered their need for money, Martin approached my father, crying over his broken piggy bank and the shattered promise of saving up. My father, angered by Martin's story, vowed to call Kevin. My mother suggested finding out their purpose calmly, as Brian's mention of divorce might shift blame to us, making the divorce more favorable for him. To ascertain their purpose, I decided to record their conversation, consulting a lawyer who was a friend of my father's. Returning home, I began cooking dinner, keeping my phone screen down to record secretly. Brian arrived home, surprising me by immediately asking about my cash cards. When I questioned him, he gave vague answers, attempting to deceive me. When I remained silent, Brian grew agitated and demanded all my part-time money for his sister. Refusing, I explained it was for Martin's savings. In response, he angrily pushed the signed divorce papers toward me, declaring that I was living off his money and didn't need to save for Martin. He even uttered words implying he valued Jane more than our son. Hearing this, I stopped preparing the meal, put the divorce papers in my bag, took Martin's hand, and headed for the door. Kevin, in a loud voice, declared his serious intent for divorce, instructing me never to come back. I responded by stating I wouldn't return to a house where a stranger could come and go freely. After leaving, I received numerous messages and calls from Kevin, which I ignored. Turning off my phone, I sought refuge at my parents' house, sharing the recording and divorce papers with them. Although I confessed to having no love or affection for Kevin, I expressed concern for Martin. My parents advised me to do as I pleased, acknowledging the potential emotional impact on Martin if a divorce were to occur. While grappling with the decision to divorce Kevin, Martin expressed his hunger. My mother, seeing my distress, kindly made him hamburgers, his favorite dish. Overwhelmed with emotions, tears welled up in my eyes as my mother told Martin, with a warm smile, that she prepared the hamburgers so that he and I could visit whenever we wanted. Taking a bite, Martin exclaimed with joy, praising Gran's hamburgers and expressing a desire to eat them every day. I responded, saying it's because the hamburger contains the love I have for him. In a touching gesture, he took a big bite and offered it to me. Moved by Martin's kindness, my tears couldn't be held back, and even though I tried to stop them, they persisted. My father, noticing Martin's concern, reassured him that my tears were of happiness, not sadness. Hearing this, Martin, in a moment of understanding, hugged me, and my father's eyes turned bright red, realizing the blessing of being with family. I remarked to Martin that family is precious. Surprised, he questioned if Dad had mentioned that only Jane was family. My father gently confirmed it, but then asked Martin if he wanted to live with them as family. With a laugh, Martin happily agreed, making everyone smile. Naturally, despite contemplating divorce, the meal felt so happy that I finally decided to part ways with Kevin. I planned to inform Martin about it, and even though discussing it weighed heavily on my heart, Martin seemed to grasp the situation happily. He expressed the desire to live as a family, embracing the pet dog and calling him his younger brother, despite the dog being older. Preparations for the divorce began, starting with contacting a lawyer who was a friend of my father. The next day, we formalized the contract, and my father and Martin shared comforting laughter while I lay in bed reminiscing about my childhood. The following day, upon checking my smartphone, I found over 200 calls and messages from Kevin, showcasing his emotional instability. Exhausted, I turned off my phone and, with the lawyer's assistance, explained the situation to my parents. Jane had accumulated significant debt from a casino and shopping addiction, and Brian acted as her guarantor, planning to use my savings. The lawyer confirmed that the divorce papers had already been submitted, and Brian sobbed upon realizing it was finalized. Despite expecting disagreements about child support, he signed a pledge to pay $340 to Martin every month. In a subsequent call from Kevin, his tone lacked aggression, and he calmly admitted to financial manipulation and explained his complex feelings toward Jane. I firmly asserted my decision not to reconsider and heard his faint sobbing before he wished me happiness and hung up. Remaining strong until the end, I discussed future plans with my parents and decided to stay with them until Martin grows up. I resumed my role as a company president and later learned that Brian and Jane had informed their parents about the divorce and debt, resulting in dissownment. Today, I find happiness being with my family.
Hi there, I'm Elizabeth and I'm 27 years old. Douglas and I have been wed for 2 years. Although we are not yet parents, the sudden death of Douglas's father, Keith, changed our lives drastically. Everyone was completely taken aback by his unexpected demise from a heart attack. Douglas and I were living in a different state at the time, distant from his family. Subtly, Douglas's uncle made a suggestion during the funeral that Douglas was supposed to go back home because he was Keith's only son and youngest. He was needed by the family, particularly by his mother Ashley, who would require assistance following the death of her husband. Douglas informed me a few months later that he had made plans to move to an office close to his family's house. I was greatly offended by his choice, which he made without consulting me. I believed that such a significant shift in our lives ought to have been decided upon jointly. Douglas apologized and acknowledged that he had anticipated my opposition to the proposal when I voiced my anger. He clarified that he believed it would be best to move closer in order to support his mother. Additionally, he brought up my tense relationship with Ashley and stated that he didn't want it to affect his choice. Ashley and I have never had a good relationship. Due to our hectic schedules, we only traveled when we were on long vacations when we lived far away. Ashley frequently bemoaned our infrequent visits, contrasting us with Douglas's sisters, Stephanie and Catherine, who reside close and frequently visit. Douglas consistently stood up for us, claiming that regular visits were challenging due to our distance and employment obligations. But Ashley's biggest grievance with me has always been that we don't yet have kids. She freely asked why we hadn't started a family during a summer visit, concentrating on if I could even conceive. For me, it was a really embarrassing time. In spite of everything, I chose to move in with Douglas. I assumed I could get by since we wouldn't be spending all of our time at his mother's house. Ashley seems really pleased with my choice, which surprised me. She even asked me to tea a few weeks after we moved. I grudgingly decided to go because this was the first time she had tried so hard. Ashley and Stephanie were waiting to welcome me when I got to Ashley's house. "Elizabeth, it's been so long," Stephanie stated in a mocking tone. "Since you moved here, why haven't you come?" I already felt bad about coming. "I was so happy when you decided to move closer, but it seems I was wrong," Ashley replied, sounding almost joyous. "I take it you don't like me." I was surprised by what she said. This move was obviously going to be more complicated than I had anticipated. The stress I had previously experienced had only gotten worse, and I became aware that there might be difficulties ahead in this new phase of our life that I wasn't entirely ready for. I considered confirming Ashley's suspicion to see how she would respond, but I changed my mind. Rather, I said, "I don't think you're bad. I've simply been feeling ill as a result of acclimating to the new surroundings." That was partially true. Douglas hadn't even informed me of this visit, and I had been sleeping a lot at home due to fatigue. Why had I come here to listen to their critical comments? Ashley wasted no time accusing me of not liking her, but wasn't it the other way around? How are we supposed to get along when the atmosphere was always like this? Before I could even process her words, Steph jumped in sharply, saying, "How can you talk to your mother-in-law like that? Apologize to her right now." I expected Ashley to get angry or scold me, but what she said next left me completely surprised. "You're right," she said. "I've been mean, and I'm sorry, Elizabeth. I'm also sorry about the things I said about children. I was being nosy." Her tone wasn't sarcastic or harsh. It was genuinely apologetic. I braced myself, expecting some hidden jab or lecture, but it didn't come. Even Stephanie looked surprised. Then Ashley confessed something that caught me off guard. "All I've ever wanted is to hold a grandchild," she said quietly. She explained that Stephanie's husband was infertile, and Catherine seemed to be having trouble conceiving as well. Because of this, Ashley had pinned all her hopes on Douglas and me. I had known about Stephanie and Catherine's struggles, and hearing this softened my frustration a little. Douglas and I had talked about having children and were considering it, but I didn't like the pressure Ashley was putting on us. I decided to speak up. "Please just give us some time," I said, lowering my head slightly. "We're thinking about it, but it's not something that can be rushed. I'm sorry if I've upset you." Ashley nodded, and the tension seemed to fade. "Do you visit us sometimes?" I added softly, trying to bridge the gap between us. After that, Ashley and Stephanie turned their attention back to the TV. Ashley casually remarked, "I like this announcer. She's so energetic and bright." As I watched them chatting and sipping their tea, I felt a small pang of regret. Maybe if I had been more outgoing or approachable, things might have been different between us. It was a fleeting thought, but I couldn't ignore it. For the first time, I felt like there was a chance things could improve. Later that evening, my optimism was crushed. Douglas came home visibly upset. "I heard from Mom that you told her you have no intention of getting along with her," he said, his voice sharp. "She was crying, Elizabeth." "What did you say?" I was stunned. Earlier, he'd left with a smile, but now he seemed to think I'd caused a disaster. "Douglas, there's been a misunderstanding," I tried to explain. "I only said it's hard to build a friendship given how things are now. How does that mean I don't want to get along?" But Douglas didn't seem convinced. The fragile progress I thought we'd made with Ashley felt like it was unraveling already. I was scared. Douglas now seemed to fully believe Ashley's twisted version of events. The smile he had earlier felt like a lie, and I didn't know how to handle this situation. I tried to explain myself again, but he wasn't convinced. Then my phone buzzed with a message from Stephanie. It read, "After all the effort of moving here, weren't you prepared to make it work? If you're here with us, you need to be more patient." Douglas glanced at me, and his expression echoed Stephanie's words. I felt overwhelmed. I had moved here because I cared about being with him, not to win over Ashley or Stephanie. Facing Douglas, I looked him in the eye and said it's clear that Ashley and the others might never approve of me. Maybe you should consider being with someone she likes more. Before I realized it, the word divorce slipped out of my mouth for the first time. Douglas looked truly alarmed. "Wait, hold on," he said, bewildered. "How did we jump to divorce? I just want you to get along better with my family." He didn't seem to understand that his family might never fully accept me, no matter what I did. It left me feeling even more confused. But Douglas, to his credit, seemed determined to fix things. The next day, he came home late from work and shared what had happened. He told me he had spoken to Ashley, and she admitted there had been a misunderstanding. She even apologized. "What a fuss," he said casually, as if it was all over now. Then Douglas mentioned that Ashley's birthday was coming up. "How about we celebrate her birthday at a nice restaurant?" he suggested. The sudden shift from conflict to celebration was hard for me to process. It felt like we had jumped from chaos to pretending everything was fine. He suggested that if we made it seem like the dinner was my idea, it might help Ashley see me in a better light. I wasn't sure if Ashley would appreciate the gesture given her complicated nature, but I agreed to make the reservation. I invited Stephanie and the others, booking a table for 8. Douglas approved of the plan, but as the dinner approached, I felt a growing unease. Douglas had been distant lately. His responses to me were short and indifferent, making me feel isolated. On the night of the dinner, we arrived at the restaurant to find Ashley, Stephanie, and their spouses already seated. The host led Douglas and me to the table, giving us a polite but questioning look that only made my nerves worse. "Happy birthday, Ashley," I said, trying to sound cheerful, but deep down, I wondered if this dinner was really going to improve anything, or if it was just another way for me to feel out of place. I greeted Ashley cheerfully, hoping to ease some of the tension and bridge the gap between us. However, she didn't even acknowledge me. Instead, she turned to everyone else, thanking them for coming to celebrate her birthday. Her deliberate snub stung, and I couldn't help but feel hurt. Stephanie seemed confused by the atmosphere. "I thought this was supposed to be a family gathering," she said, glancing at me with a puzzled expression. Catherine, noticing the tension, looked at me with concern. In that moment, I realized I was being excluded on purpose. Determined not to let it ruin my evening, I decided to keep to myself and leave early. Just as I settled on this plan, a staff member approached our table, looking uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, but the reservation was actually made for 7 people," he said. Confused, I replied, "That can't be right. I clearly reserved for 8. Could there be a mistake?" The staff member hesitated, then explained, "About a week ago, we received a call from a gentleman asking to change the reservation to 7. I froze. Slowly, I turned to Douglas, searching for an explanation. His response floored me. "Yes, 7 is correct. Everyone's here now," he said plainly, confirming that he had made the change himself. A wave of disbelief and betrayal washed over me. Douglas's actions spoke volumes. Despite his earlier promises to mend things, his efforts to smooth family tensions had been shallow at best. I felt manipulated and deeply hurt, realizing he had orchestrated this behind my back. Before I could process everything, Douglas turned to me with an accusatory glare. "I heard from Mom that you've been undermining our family," he began, his voice sharp. "She said you've been telling people I don't earn enough and that I'm insensitive. You had a lot to say, didn't you?" His words hit me like a punch in the gut. I was stunned. It turned out that a week ago, when Douglas had contacted Ashley about the dinner, she had filled his head with lies. Blinded by anger and believing her, he had called the restaurant, pretended to be me, and changed the reservation to 7. The staff, recognizing the family name, hadn't questioned the change. I couldn't believe Douglas had been so easily manipulated. The realization that he had sided with Ashley without even asking me for the truth was deeply unsettling. In that moment, I questioned why I was even there. I confronted Douglas, demanding that he apologize to everyone at the table and reflect on his actions. But instead of apologizing, he did something unexpected. He insisted that his actions were justified. "I just wanted to make sure things went smoothly," he said, as if that excused everything. His refusal to take responsibility made it clear that the distance between us wasn't just physical, it was emotional. I didn't know how or if it could be repaired. I thought about apologizing to my in-laws just to keep the peace, but deep down I knew I couldn't do it. I hadn't done anything wrong, and I refused to admit to things I never said. Besides, what was the point of a marriage where my husband believed his mother over me? Tears of frustration filled my eyes as I questioned why I had even followed Douglas here. Seeing my distress, Douglas began to panic, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. Ashley, watching everything unfold, had a smug smile on her face, clearly satisfied that her plan was working. Her manipulations had succeeded in driving a wedge between us. I looked at Douglas coldly and said, "Next time, marry someone younger and more obedient. Maybe then you'll have children and be happier." Ashley's response was swift and cutting. "Elizabeth, why don't you just go back to your parents' house? A daughter-in-law is always an outsider. I can't see you as family. You're not charming at all, so please leave quickly." Her words stung, but they also solidified my decision. "I'll leave even without you telling me," I said firmly. "I'd like to see anyone get along with someone as twisted as you." With that, I turned and walked out of the restaurant. Douglas stayed behind, silent, with his head in his hands. Just as I reached the exit, I heard someone calling my name. I turned to see Catherine and her husband hurrying after me. "Elizabeth, wait," Catherine said, clearly upset. I can't stand it anymore. Mom and Stephanie haven't changed at all. I knew the gossip about you wasn't true. Catherine's words brought me a small sense of relief. In the middle of all this chaos, someone finally stood up for me. Her acknowledgement of the truth, though brief, felt like a lifeline. "I'm ready to cut ties with all this toxicity," Catherine added, her voice steady and resolute. It was a surprising moment of solidarity, and while it didn't erase the pain of what had just happened, it gave me a glimmer of hope that not everyone in Douglas's family was against me. As I stood there, processing Catherine's words, my phone buzzed. Ashley's name flashed on the screen. I sighed, wondering what she wanted now. Before I could decide whether to answer, the name on the screen changed to Douglas's. Catherine and her husband exchanged knowing looks. "Elizabeth, you might want to go back to the restaurant," Catherine said cryptically. "You might see something interesting." Her eyes hinted at a twist I hadn't expected. They left, looking oddly satisfied. But I hesitated. Curiosity battled with my need to stay far away from the drama. In the end, curiosity won. When I finally answered Douglas's call, his voice sounded frantic and filled with regret. "Elizabeth, I'm sorry," he said, his tone desperate. I didn't realize it was all a lie. Douglas blurted out on the phone, "I'll send the divorce papers later," he added hastily. But then his tone changed. "Wait, can you come back, please? It's a lifetime request." His almost childish plea made me want to laugh, but Catherine's cryptic hint earlier lingered in my mind. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to return to the restaurant. When I arrived, the scene before me was nothing like I had expected. A crowd had gathered around Douglas's table, and at the center of it all was a local TV. Announcer, Ashley's favorite, speaking into a microphone. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Ashley looked flustered, stumbling over her words as she tried to explain herself. "No, that's not it. We were just. It's a misunderstanding," she stammered. Douglas and Stephanie sat awkwardly, their discomfort written all over their faces. They clearly hadn't anticipated this sudden turn of events. The announcer, holding the microphone with authority, pressed Ashley for answers. "You love declared in the restaurant that Elizabeth is an outsider and should leave. What did you mean by that? Please explain in detail." Ashley's face turned pale, and her usual confidence seemed to evaporate. The tables had turned, and now she was the one under scrutiny. Meanwhile, Catherine's husband and a few others who had been offended earlier had quietly left, wanting no part in the escalating drama. I stood frozen, watching this surreal scene unfold. It took me a moment to piece together what was happening. It seemed that our family conflict had turned into a public spectacle, possibly even being broadcast live. My earlier frustration gave way to a mix of vindication and disbelief as I tried to make sense of it all. A staff member approached me, noticing my confusion. "It's been quite a day, hasn't it?" they remarked with a wide smile. They explained that the restaurant had scheduled a live TV recording that day, which explained the announcer's presence. The camera crew and microphones had captured everything, turning our family dinner into an unexpected media event. The realization that our drama had been broadcast for all to see was both shocking and oddly satisfying. Ashley's harsh words, which she had so confidently uttered earlier, were now laid bare for everyone to judge. Just as I stepped aside to gather my thoughts, I noticed the announcer approach Ashley with a smile. "Would you mind giving an interview?" she asked brightly. Ashley, an avid fan of the announcer, looked thrilled. "An interview? Absolutely. she exclaimed, forgetting her earlier embarrassment. The announcer beamed. The topic is daughter-in-law and mother-in-law relationships. Ashley's face faltered for a moment, realizing the irony of the situation. I couldn't help but smirk as I watched her wrestle with her own words. The evening had taken a bizarre turn, but in some strange way, justice had been served. We heard there was a heated argument earlier, and the daughter-in-law left in tears. "Can you tell us what happened?" the announcer asked, turning the spotlight directly on Ashley. Ashley and Stephanie froze, their faces pale. They were clearly caught off guard and didn't know how to respond. The truth was too embarrassing to admit. They had deliberately manipulated the situation to alienate me. From across the room, Douglas saw me and rushed over, his face full of desperation. "Elizabeth, please," he begged. "I can't let this shame be known. It was all a misunderstanding." His voice cracked, and he looked completely defeated. But by then, I had no sympathy left for him. Whatever feelings I once had for Douglas had evaporated. Ashley, trying to save face, forced a strange smile and attempted to smooth things over. "Oh, we usually call each other Elizabeth." "Elizabeth, come here," she called out, waving me over. I walked up slowly, knowing I had nothing left to lose. The announcer directed the microphone toward me. "You say you call each other Elizabeth, but how does the daughter-in-law view her mother-in-law?" I smiled faintly, my voice calm. "I've never been called Elizabeth by her," I said, looking Ashley in the eye. "What I've been called, though, is unpatriotic, because I haven't had children yet." Ashley has made it clear she thinks that's reason enough for a divorce. The crowd murmured and Ashley's smile faltered. I continued, my tone steady. "The truth is, Douglas and I haven't felt ready or confident enough to start a family. We haven't even tried in over 2 years, but that's never stopped Ashley from criticizing me." I paused, then added, "When I first fell ill and had to take a leave from work, Douglas was supportive. I appreciated that and decided to follow him here, thinking a change of environment might help me recover. But this is the result." I gestured to the scene around us. By then, I felt no sadness, only detachment as I spoke. I noticed Ashley and Stephanie's expressions. They looked utterly humiliated, their earlier confidence replaced with embarrassment. For the first time all day, I felt a small sense of satisfaction. The announcer, sensing the weight of my words, didn't interrupt. As I glanced at the cameras, I realized this might be broadcast nationwide. Watching Ashley squirm under the scrutiny, I couldn't help but smile. "Well," I said, turning back to Ashley, "since the daughter-in-law is considered an outsider, I guess I should leave. Goodbye." I walked out of the restaurant, ignoring the shouts and commotion behind me. The day had been long, chaotic, and emotionally draining, but as I stepped outside, I felt an unexpected sense of freedom. For the first time, I didn't feel weighed down by the drama. I felt lighter, as though I had finally let go of the toxic environment I had tried so hard to endure. And with that, I kept walking, savoring the release of leaving it all behind. I felt a mix of relief and satisfaction after everything that had happened. Even though Ashley and her family managed to prevent the footage from being broadcast, the incident had already caused quite a stir in our local community. The story spread quickly among relatives and acquaintances, becoming the center of gossip and speculation. After the drama, I returned to my room, packed my belongings, and moved back to my parents' house. I sent Douglas the divorce papers, but he took his time responding. Frustrated by the delay, I started considering hiring a lawyer to finalize things. One day, I was shocked to see Douglas at my parents' house. Gerald, my father, who is often cool under pressure, took a hard stance. Douglas expressed his profound regret, stated that he wished to break off contact with his family, and pledged to fully trust me going forward. But I thought his remarks were meaningless. It came too late and too little. Gerald didn't hold back, clearly disturbed by the hurt Douglas had caused me over the years. He questioned aggressively, "Why didn't you realize this sooner? After all these years, what have you done to Elizabeth? Simply sign the divorce documents and go." Douglas's face was etched with remorse. He gave the signed divorce papers to her, trembling. It didn't matter that his handwriting was weak and hardly readable. Our marriage was formally over when the paperwork was processed without any problems. I soon discovered more about the reality of Stephanie's predicament. As she had stated, her husband was not the reason of her infertility. Rather, it was her own health problems. Her own marriage ended as a result of this realization. She stopped going to see Ashley and ceased being involved with the family. Douglas, who is now divorced, moved back to their little village to live with Ashley. They probably had to deal with constant gossip and criticism from others, but I was no longer interested in their lives. I had finally closed that chapter of my life. My life started to become better in the months that followed. I got back in touch with a classmate from my hometown. We fell in love right away and were married. In contrast to my previous marriage, this one was characterized by understanding and joy. Our lovely daughter, who is now a year old, was born shortly after. I'm expecting our second child right now, which will only make us happier. Ashley and my new mother-in-law couldn't be more different. She is considerate, encouraging, and shows me true affection and respect. She has truly been a blessing in my life, providing the love and affection I never imagined I would find in a family. Despite the unpredictability of life, I feel content and loved right now. I am incredibly thankful for this new phase of my life, which has given me the support and happiness I once believed were unattainable.
At long last, the day has come when I don't have to see your face anymore. Freeloaders who just eat without working should get out. You should be thankful for being allowed to be a freeloader all this time. Understood? I won't come back. Thank you for everything up to now. I quickly packed what I needed and left my in-laws' place where I had been living for many years. My mother-in-law looked very pleased as she watched me leave. However, only I know a certain sad truth. I know what's going to happen to this house. My name is Sarah. I'm 32 years old and I work from home. I've been married to my husband Alan for 5 years. We had a peaceful life as a couple, but things changed in our 4th year of marriage. My normally healthy father-in-law suddenly became ill and needed care. That's how we started living with my in-laws. I didn't agree with the idea of living with them so soon, but my husband is an only child with no other family for my in-laws to rely on. We ended up taking care of my father-in-law. I thought about quitting my job if it were necessary for his care, but based on my past performance, my company allowed me to continue working remotely. Trouble with my in-laws started right away. Yes, I experienced the so-called mother-in-law and daughter-in-law problem too. Sarah, hurry up and take care of the cooking and cleaning. How long are you going to be lazy and avoid your housework, mother-in-law? I'm working right now. What are you talking about? You're always just clicking away on the computer. The truth is, you're just browsing the internet, not really working. Right. Thinking that using the computer equates to playing around on the internet is so outdated. I have permission to work from home from my company. In between the household chores and caring for my father-in-law, I've used my skills to get back to the salary I was earning before. And after about 3 months of hard work, when I finally managed to bring my salary back to the amount before, I felt a real sense of joy. As for the reason that I worked so hard, the truth is, Alan's salary isn't enough for us to make ends meet. I had thought that life was finally going to get easier. I even thought about starting to put money away. but for some reason things just kept getting harder. It felt like the contents of my wallet just kept dwindling. Suspicious, I looked into where the money was going and found out that Alan had been spending a lot. I also learned that my mother-in-law was terribly wasteful with money. Alan has always been a people-pleaser, often treating his juniors at work to lunch. But lately, it seems that he's also been using our credit cards to treat people to drinking parties as well. It doesn't matter how much I earn. If Alan uses more than that, our finances will inevitably dwindle. As for my mother-in-law, she's balancing multiple hobbies with her friends, generously paying the lesson fees, and socializing afterwards. I can't stand the fact that my husband and mother-in-law continue their wasteful spending, leaving all the housework and care for my father-in-law to me. I've ended up having to cover all our living expenses with my income, making saving money a dream. Feeling anxious about this problem, I decided to talk to my husband and mother-in-law. Alan, mother-in-law, it seems like we've been spending quite a lot lately. If this continues, we'll run out of money. Could you please try to cut back on your expenses? Ellen and my mother-in-law reacted harshly to my words. I don't want to be embarrassed. I don't want to be seen as stingy in front of my colleagues and subordinates. You can understand that, right? They won't think you're stingy just because there are times where you don't pay for them. There's no need to treat them every single time. You don't seem to understand. But for work to go smoothly, you have to keep good relationships with your coworkers. Treating your juniors to lunch is one thing, but what about the trips to the girls' bars? That has nothing to do with work, right? You just want to have fun, don't you? How dare you come home drunk and start talking about it even if no one asks you? That just means he has a more enjoyable time there than spending time with you. I'm glad that Mom understands, and she's right. And as for me, if I didn't go to my classes, I'd just be cooped up at home. I'm taking classes with my friends to enjoy the limited time I have left in this world. What a terrible daughter-in-law I have. All you do is the housework, and you don't earn anything, so you have no right to complain. Really, though, what is she thinking? A homemaker looking down on us from her high horse. I'm telling you, I'm working. I'm earning a steady income and contributing to this household. I'm also doing housework and taking care of father-in-law. Don't lie, working from home. You can't be earning that much. Mother is the one doing the living. Don't act so high and mighty for a part-timer. I was so appalled by what I was hearing I couldn't even reply. They didn't seem to understand that I was balancing the housework with caregiving, all while earning a steady income. Moreover, it seemed that my mother-in-law had told Alan that she was the one taking care of my father-in-law, making it sound like I was a homemaker who did nothing. There were several times when I thought about leaving that house. I did consider it, but the reason I ended up staying was because of my father-in-law. Ever since I got married, my father-in-law always treated me very kindly, unlike Alan and my mother-in-law. He always told me things like this. Sarah, I'm grateful to have a wonderful daughter-in-law like you. I'm sorry for everything, father-in-law. I don't find it hard to care for you. Why would you say that? Of course I feel bad asking you to take care of me like this, but more than that, I feel terrible about my wife and son. Everything's been left to you, and they do as they please, right? Yes, that's right. I realize that it's thanks to your hard work that our household finances are being kept afloat. Ellen's income alone wouldn't be enough to maintain this household, father-in-law. You knew all this time. It seemed that father-in-law had understood our family's situation for quite some time, and every time he received care, he would show his appreciation with heart-warming words. I truly loved such a father-in-law, and even came to enjoy caring for him. What would happen to this house if I left? I had anxiety about who would take care of my beloved father-in-law, so I decided to be the one to provide proper care until he passed away. A year later, my father-in-law left this world. During the funeral for my beloved father-in-law, I couldn't stop the tears. Sarah, why are you crying so much? What? Father-in-law has passed away. Isn't mourning like this natural? I've been his caregiver all this time. My response seemed to infuriate my mother-in-law. You make it sound as if I never took care of him at all. The truth is, my mother-in-law hardly took care of my father-in-law. She was always busy with her hobbies, going out all the time. Since I was home, she didn't need to do any caregiving or housework. She even put on a tearful act in front of the relatives, as if she were the oppressed and pitiful mother-in-law. To outsiders, it probably seemed as if I was the cruel daughter-in-law. They would defend her, saying, "Don't be so hard on mother-in-law," and blame me instead, even though I was just mourning my father-in-law's death. I was being criticized by people who understood nothing, which made me angry. I decided to distance myself from the relatives. That's when Ellen took notice of me and came over to complain. "You embarrassed Mom in front of everyone." "What are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. I was only crying about father-in-law's death." Despite that, your mom came over and told me it was strange for me to cry. Didn't you make it sound like she hadn't taken care of Dad at all? I never said such a thing. I just talked about mourning the loss of my father-in-law, whom I had always cared for. Perhaps it sounded like criticism to you because in reality, your mom did nothing. Are you insulting Mom? I'm not insulting anyone. I'm just stating the facts. And by the way, if it bothers you so much, you could have done more to care for father-in-law too. If you're so upset about it, you should have cared for him yourself. What business is it of yours? Why are you criticizing me? How can it be none of my business? It's only natural that you, his blood relative, would take care of him. I'm working for this family, taking care of the house. Our relatives are wife duties. That's absurd. Don't be so ridiculous. I'm working too, you know. Our argument escalated, and the relatives had to intervene. Although they stopped our argument, I didn't speak to my husband at all after that. Once all the funeral proceedings were finished, a lawyer came to explain the inheritance. I'd like to discuss the contents of the will regarding your late father's estate first, to the wife and the daughter-in-law, Sarah. He's left half of his cash to each of you and to his son, Ellen. He's left ownership of the family land and home. What if Ellen gets the land and the house? Doesn't that mean all the other assets go to the wife? Why is Sarah receiving an inheritance? I'm his wife. Your husband was deeply grateful to Sarah for the dedicated care that she gave him. He wanted to give her part of the inheritance as a sign of his gratitude. As this is the decision he made, it cannot be changed. I can't believe it. Oh, I get it. You were caring for him just to get the inheritance, weren't you? How could you think that? That has to be it. Otherwise, there's no way you could have been so devoted to him despite not being related by blood. I had a good relationship with my father-in-law ever since I got married. I took care of him to express my gratitude for that. Are you saying that you tried to let me, someone who isn't related by blood, take care of your own husband? Isn't that like psychological abuse? Don't be ridiculous. Fine, I won't bring it up anymore. Appearing frustrated that she couldn't say anything else inappropriate in front of the lawyer, my mother-in-law continued, "So, that was Dad's decision. It's grand gratitude for Sarah's caring, right? If that's the case, then we have no choice but to follow it. May I continue? All right? Well, your father stated that it's no longer necessary to rely on Sarah. Upon hearing this, my mother-in-law's face, which had been dissatisfied just moments ago, suddenly broke into a smile. Yes, that's great. I understand. Huh? What do you mean? My mother-in-law seemed pleased, but my husband was confused. He didn't seem to understand what she was saying. So in the end, Sarah's inheritance is nothing more than severance pay. It's not gratitude at all. Now that Dad's living is over, we don't need Sarah in this house anymore. My mother-in-law had misunderstood my father-in-law's will just as intended. The truth is, my father-in-law had discussed this with me before. My father-in-law wanted me to be free from this house after he passed away. He used the will to cleverly deceive my husband and mother-in-law, making it seem natural that I should leave. And just as my father-in-law had planned, my mother-in-law, completely misunderstanding his true intentions, saw the will as a chance to kick me out. Pretending to be shocked by the will so as not to let on that I actually wanted to leave, I said, "Father-in-law, why would you treat me like this? See, even to Dad, you were just someone that would take care of him." "Ellen, you can't understand Sarah anymore, right? Why don't you just divorce her?" My husband thought about it for a while and then said, "You know what? Let's get a divorce. I've inherited the family home and land, and Mom got some money too. There's no longer any need to worry about living, so there's no problem if Sarah goes." "Huh? What do you mean by that?" "Just what I said. I feel bad for asking, but could you leave our house and agree to the divorce?" "Understood. I guess there's no place for me here anymore." Saying such with a bit of restraint, I took a document out of the drawer and handed it to my husband. After that time we fought, I went and got this. No mistake. The document was a notice of filing for divorce. My husband promptly signed it. Finally, I don't have to deal with you anymore. A non-working freeloader should just get out. LS, you should be grateful for us having put up with you. A total freeloader. Is that so? Okay, I understand. I'll leave. Thank you for everything up to now. Won't. By the way, since the lawyer is here, I want to check one thing. It's okay that I don't get any more than what I've already received from father-in-law's estate, right? Of course. You seem to have gotten a bit smarter, Sarah. You've been living off me until now, so don't even think about squeezing any more money out of me. Well, I suppose you're right. All right, it's settled then. Please make yourself disappear quickly. I promptly packed my things and left my in-laws' house. Watching me leave, my mother-in-law looked as pleased as could be. They had no idea what would happen to this house in the future. After leaving my in-laws' house, I immediately submitted the divorce notice to City Hall, and when I arrived at the apartment, I had rented in advance. I couldn't help but shout out loud in the spacious room, "Finally, I can be by myself. This is great." I was overwhelmed with joy to be freed from such a difficult marriage, and I was truly grateful to my father-in-law for devising the plan to help me escape my in-laws' home. Afterwards, I enjoyed a comfortable life living on my own. Because I was able to get used to working remotely while living at my in-laws' place, I had become better at managing my time, and work went smoothly. Thanks to that, my income increased, and I was living a comfortable life without anyone bothering me. Until one day, my ex-husband Alan called me. "It's been a while. Why are you calling me?" "We're in a pinch, Sarah. Please help us." "What kind of joke is this? Weren't you the ones who told me to disappear?" "My salary hasn't changed, but for some reason we're running out of money. We can't live like this." "Oh dear. That's a problem, isn't it?" I decided to deliver the final blow. "That's because you no longer have my income to support you." "Huh? What do you mean? You still don't get it? Didn't you notice while living so lavishly that your salary alone was not enough?" "I had thought that we could live on my salary alone, but you're telling me that's not the case?" "Of course. You squandered your entire salary on yourself." "We only got by because I was the one paying for our living expenses. Maybe it's about time you and your mother learned some financial responsibility as adults." "How much were you making then?" "Let's see. At that time, I was making about $4,800 a month. Maybe that's more than me. That's right. You didn't know, did you? By the way, now I'm earning even more than that, with no one to get in my way. Even through the phone, I could clearly feel my husband's frustration. Hey, Sarah, can't we start over? It was a mistake to let you go. I want to make things right again. Huh? It's obvious you're after my income. Are you stupid? That's not true. I still love you, Sarah. Don't be ridiculous. I never want to see your face again. By the way, what happened to the inheritance your mother received? With that amount, she should be living comfortably, right? That's the thing. It's about to run out. That's impossible. It was nearly $100,000, right? That's not an amount you can use up in just a few months. Mom and I spent it on a shopping spree, overseas trips, and half of it disappeared in the casino. A foolish mother breeds a foolish son. I have nothing more to say to you. Besides, I'm a stranger now, so I can't do anything for you, and I don't want to. Don't be so heartless. Help me. This has nothing to do with me. There's nothing more to talk about. Saying this, I ended the call on my end and promptly canceled the contract for the mobile phone I was using. What became of my ex-husband and mother-in-law afterward is none of my business, and I do not know. However, about a year after that call, I passed by my mother-in-law's house, and it had become an empty lot. They probably had to let go of the house due to financial reasons. Well, it's really none of my business. Anyway, as for me, with my newfound spare time, I started going to a wine class that I had been interested in for some time. There, I met a man 2 years my senior who took me seriously, and after dating for a year and a half, we got married. He is the ace of a well-known company that many people are aware of, and despite his high salary, he is humble with a warm and wonderful character. He respects my career, and we enjoy a fulfilling married life filled with mutual respect. These days, I feel that maybe all this retribution was a gift from my father-in-law.